All right.
That-
Um,
That'd be good.
okay. So Christina, I'm gonna put you on the spot. What out of the documents that we have, what is the document you think would be most valuable to go through for you?
Probably the purchase agreement, so I know what goes where.
Okay.
And if a client is asking for a certain credit or closing costs or
Yeah.
anything like that, I know exactly where that goes.
Okay. Perfect. Well, then
Yeah,
let's
'cause
do it.
I just want to make sure I'm legal and I don't have another hiccup like I did this past weekend.
Yeah. No worries. No worries. Um, yeah. Well, first of all, let me go ahead and say this as a blanket statement. Anyone who's been in real estate for more than 5 minutes and written a contract and says they haven't had a hiccup is not being honest. So I've always said that we should do a panel discussion, and we've done it every now and then in team meetings where you have experienced agents that tell horror stories, right? Because I think it would alleviate some of the anxiety that we go through the first couple times we write contracts. And oh, by the way, we're currently, just so you know, we are currently dealing with a very experienced agent, someone that I would go to for questions as well, who we may have to be buying a range for our buyer because it wasn't written into the contract, because for a lot of times we just assume that a range, particularly in a renovated kitchen, goes with the property. Right. And so here's an agent who's, she's not beating herself up, but she's, you know what, if I missed it and I got to, buy a range at closing, then I'll do that. Nobody wants to do that. However, I just tell you that so you know that it's not unprecedented to make mistakes. I almost burned a house down for one of my first clients. So it's and that's not an exaggeration. So don't beat yourself up and keep coming to stuff like this.
Yeah.
Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through. Yeah, Shenandoah, go ahead.
Wait, back up. Um, I assume all the time that ranges are included if it's in the house.
Yeah, so that's it really we got an email from the Association of Realtors, or the South Carolina Realtors Association attorney, that said that it is considered an appliance and it is plugged in and should be addressed in the contract. And in this situation, that the suggestion was the parties should work it out so no one has to sue. So
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
Well, and then the argument becomes that, some people say, well, it's only an appliance and it's plugged in. And then someone else will say, well, if you have the anti-tilt brace on there, it's actually attached to the wall. So there are a handful of different arguments that can be gone for that. So, and like anything, when in doubt, put it in writing, right? It's and that's the big thing. So, well, let's jump on that. If Shenandoah, you're good with that, we'll go through a purchase and sale agreement then. All right, let me pull one up. And Christina, I don't know, have you seen me go through a purchase and sale agreement before?
No, I have not. So, yes.
So my recommendation on this is, first of all, it will be a lot of information. Write down as much as you can. And in the event you have any questions, obviously let me know. Or we can, you can shoot email to me. You can fill out a contract so you can kind of go see what that looks like, and we'll go from there. So, all right. So I'm going to go to Zip Forms Plus to get the document. I'll also throw it into the chat box if you want to download it. But as the purchase and sale agreement itself is Form 310.
Mm-hmm.
Where did it go? See if I can drop it on there really quickly. Well, I thought it was going to let me do that, but it is not. So I'll email it to you really quickly. Christina, what's the best email for you?
It's Christina, Christina, Green with E on the end, like my last name, Holmes gmail.com.
All right, just so you can have this. And also understand that you don't go to one contract class and learn everything.
Oh, yeah.
You'll continually be learning it. And like I said, that's what the reason I am here is to help you with that. All right, so let's jump into the contracts. That's not what I wanted to do. Here we go. Okay. So you should see hopefully in front of you the purchase and sale agreement, correct?
Yes.
Or the agreement to buy and sell real estate. So paragraph 1's pretty kind of fill in the blank, right? You want all the parties that are going to be on there, the buyer and the seller. The seller, you want to not only look at the tax records, but you also want to make sure that you double check with the seller to make sure there's not someone on the tax records that is not listed, or on the deed that is not listed on the tax records. Best case scenario is you get a copy of the deed. I will tell you that the majority of real estate agents do not do that. They rely on the tax records and word of mouth with the seller. The reason that could be a challenge actually came up today with one of our agents. They found out as we did title search, there is another person that is on the deed, and the seller thought it was okay because they had an oral agreement for him to take over his interest in the property. Luckily, there's not a sour relationship or anything. So in that situation, all that needed to happen is that we added the second person to the contract and had them sign off on all the terms, right? So that's a best case scenario of something coming up, right?
Mm-hmm.
What you don't want to happen is come up before closing. You've got someone that was not properly removed from the deed, and then you're having to go through probate or through courts and systems and that sort of thing. So, tax records is a good place to start. Double check with the seller, and then if there is any situation where you know that it's a divorce situation or some sort of situation that may cause a potential issue, you can always have the attorney look into it ahead of time and do a title search even sooner so we can find out what paperwork we need. The definitions in here are basically just definitions of the contract, right? You can read through each one of those. This is where the buyer can pick a closing attorney here. They do not have to. And this is where the buyer is going to have the closing attorney. The seller can always have their own closing attorney if they would like, separate from the buyer's attorney. Effective date is the date that the contract was signed. It also refers to the date of any sort of deadlines in the contract, right? So effective date of the could also refer to when the earnest money is turned in, when the repairs are due, those sorts of things. It's really the final date upon the negotiation places come into place, right? And we agree upon that. Second part of paragraph 1 is where they are disclosing whether or not the buyer or seller is a licensed real estate agent in South Carolina. And then they disclose here, they initial and confirm that they have been given the disclosure of brokerage relationships and they're receiving either client or customer service in this transaction. So if you were in a situation where you had a seller and you got a sign call and you decided that the buyer was coming in and you were doing a transaction brokerage with that person just because you had no relationship and you didn't, and your seller would prefer you to stay only their agent, you would still have the buyer initial as saying that they're getting customer service in this transaction, that they are just really, it's really a transaction brokerage situation. If it's a dual agent situation or designated, they obviously would both check client there. And then of course, if it's separate representation altogether, they would be checking client.
Okay.
Okay. Purchase price. This is the first part of the contract where we start talking about the financing. This is where they disclose what kind of financing they're going to be getting for the property. It's either going to be financed, a combination of financing in cash or cash. 99% of the time, it'll be a combination of financing and cash, right? They're going to get an 80% loan with 20% down. And then they will also disclose here whether or not they have given verification of cash for closing, right? So it's either attached or it's not attached. If you do get a cash offer as a listing agent, I would want this filled in to at least say will be delivered before a certain date, just so you know what it is that your client is getting into or when you're going to have that information.
Okay.
Contract is or is not contingent upon the sale of a buyer's property. This is the only place where this is really disclosed, and it's a very small line, which I don't love. There are two boxes to choose here. One, it is whether or not it's contingent upon the home selling. And then two, if they've included what's called South Carolina Realtor Form 504, which is the form that lays out the details of the contingency of their home selling. As a buyer, that form's not as important because it limits you, right? So if I'm submitting an offer on a property and I tell them it's contingent on a home sale, but I don't give them that form, it's really not that terrible of a thing because I'm really protected, right? It's contingent. If my home doesn't sell, it doesn't sell. As a seller, you're going to want South Carolina 504 Form 504 signed because it does lay out the deadlines of when the home should be on the market, when the home should have a contract, when the home should close, and then what happens if any of those deadlines are not hit. So super important to include that. I say that it's not as important from the buyer side. I really say that more in jest because, quite honestly, even if you are representing the buyer, it's still good to have that form on there just so there's no misunderstanding or any difference in expectations. All right, paragraph 3. This is what describes the actual property they're purchasing. Basically, this talks about the actual lot or parcel of land and then any pertinent interests, right? This would be improvements, landscaping, systems, and fixtures. They agree to maintain the property in operable conditions. This is important to explain to your seller, is that this isn't just your house, it's everything that's on the property. So once you go under contract today, Mr. Seller, you are responsible to maintain the current condition of all of the property from now until closing, aside from normal wear and tear, right? So you can't, not start, you got to keep taking care of your landscaping. You got to take care of, your sprinkler system, things, your shed, anything that's on the property that's conveying will have to be maintained in the same condition that it was. This will also include any personal property that's listed down here on the bottom of page 1. So if they do agree to sell the refrigerator that goes along, that's in the kitchen or the garage, and there is an ice maker that's not working or anything that's not working, they need to disclose that from up front, because if you go through to inspection and it comes out it's not working, even if it's in repair procedure, which we'll get to, the buyer can come back and say, hey, as far as we're concerned, this was working when we put under contract. It's not working now. You need to fix it. So you just want to make sure that if you are conveying any personal property, if they're not 100% working, you just need to disclose that. It's not to say that you have to agree to replace it. You just need to let them know ahead of time. This is where you might identify the property, right? You're going to have the address, the unit number, city, state, zip, the county that it's in. 9 times out of 10, what you're going to have is the address, county, and tax map number. The lot, block, section, and phase. If you have the deed, you can have all of that. A lot of times it's not given in the tax records. So if you do not know it, at a minimum, I would just put a dash in there and make sure that you do have the address and the tax map number.
Okay.
And then the last line here under paragraph 3 is where you talk about any personal property that will transfer as part of the sale. And if it's more than can fit on this line, you can just check this box here and have a list that you can come up either, with a Word document that everyone signs. You can put it in an addendum. You can also put it in a bill of sale. A lot of times if you do it in a bill of sale, though, the lender will want that bill of sale not to have any value in it. So they don't want to be, don't want to be giving loan on a $400,000 house that includes $400,000, or $40,000 worth of furniture or anything like that. Typically that's not happening in your average deal. Where you would have that, it would be potential investment properties, rental property. Questions about page 1?
No.
I think, Joseph, you got me really concerned about this range thing. Because right there is where I always put, if we're asking for a refrigerator, washer, or dryer.
That's where it goes, right?
Right.
It will go there, right?
Yeah.
And you'd want to be specific too. You also, the things that you don't want to put would be appliances as seen on fourth, or appliances as referenced in the MLS or anything like that. You want to be specific, so what would convey is the, Viking range and the whatever dishwasher's a hard one as well. The certain refrigerator, because if it just says refrigerator, it just says range, there's really technically nothing that says they can't go in and just switch them out.
So if we put like refrigerator as seen in the MLS, refrigerator, like house, I don't mean to be picky, but.
No, you shouldn't. You're not being picky. No, I would not reference the MLS. I would say refrigerator, like Frigidaire refrigerator, stainless refrigerator, You know, in a perfect world, you'd have the serial number, right? That's technically not going to happen. However, you could describe the refrigerator that is in there, as you've seen both in the showing the property as well as the pictures.
But don't put as seen in the MLS.
I mean, it's better than not putting anything, but it really doesn't hold any water.
Okay. All right. Good to know. Thanks.
Yep. All right, paragraph 4, conveyance and closing. Basically, this is saying when we're going to have the closing date. The important thing to remember about this is the closing date is a closing date. And after 5 p.m. on that closing date, if the property has not closed and there has been given no extension or no agreement upon the parties to do so, you do have a dead contract at that point. The reason I point that out is because so many people still are hooked on the whole grace period. I don't even remember what we called it anymore. We had a couple days where you could go past closing and not need any additional paperwork. That does not exist. So if you have a conflict, and even if it's a very, very blatant conflict, that's obvious. For instance, we were representing a buyer yesterday that was supposed to close yesterday, and come to find out that even though we were told by the buyer and the lender that they would be able to get financing on their this property without selling their home, that was not in fact the case. The seller had no idea that this was part of the financing contingency because we didn't tell them that, because we also did not know. Now, there's two stories here, right? There's two truths, I should say. One truth is yes, the buyer could clearly be said to be in default of the contract because they failed to disclose that. Okay, so there's that debate. Sure, we can have that debate, and we probably will. And you know, whether or not it was deliberate, we'll figure that out. But then there's also the truth over here that regardless of what happened over here, at 5 p.m., you don't have a contract anymore. So you can either choose to fight this and let the contract expire, or we can work together and say, okay, yes, there may be an issue here that we need to address, but in the meantime, let's at least extend the contract to figure this out. So give us, even if it's 24 hours, and if you don't like the answer that we've given you, then yeah, I mean, we can't close on the property and we can go down swinging then, but let's not go down swinging first. Let's see if we can, keep this moving forward.
What addendum extends this thing?
You could do one of two things. You can put in an addendum that simply says all parties agree the closing date shall be November 12th. You can also strike and change this paragraph and have everyone initial it.
Is there a certain number addendum that we can do the first one on?
It is.
That's your memory.
Yeah, I know. Thank you. Let me see if I can remember. I can't, but I can look it up.
That's right. I'll find it.
Yeah, I mean, it does say when it pops back up, I'll go to that one. All right, paragraph 4 is also where they talk about where they would put in here the names that they want on the title. Yeah, I mean, that's really more information for the attorney at that point. The deed shall be delivered to closing attorney's designated place on or before the closing date no later than 10 a.m. Obviously, that's something that, could be a default of the seller. If the seller does not get that, or if the deed is not delivered in time for this to be done, that could be an issue that's presented here as well. Typically, that's an attorney issue, not something that you would worry too much about. Earnest money. All right, paragraph 5, earnest money. This is the fun one. So there are earnest money. There are 2 blanks in here. The first blank says this is how much earnest money. There's a total amount of earnest money. The second blank says this is how much comes with the offer, and this is how much will be paid by a certain date at 6 p.m. Honestly, if it's not with the offer and I'm the seller, I don't want it much further than the next day by 6 p.m. If a person is purchasing a home, I don't know why they should not be ready to write a check for the earnest money. It makes me nervous when we get much further than 2, 3, 4 days out, because quite honestly, during that time, you really have nothing to protect you as the seller if the buyer changes their mind. Sure, you can go after them. Sure, they're in default, and sure, the earnest money could be yours as the seller. However, the chances of getting that and whether or not it's going to be worth the time are slim to none. So I would always recommend, from a strong offer standpoint, that you say it accompanies the offer and you have it turned in. This is also where you choose how it's being delivered, check, cash, or other. 9 times out of 10, it's going to be through check. There are companies locally that are starting to have online where you can basically go online and deposit your earnest money directly to the attorneys or the escrow agent. I know Carolina One is starting to do that. We are talking to some of the attorneys that we use to set up a situation where they can do that as well. This is
I can
also,
tell you, Weeks and Irvin, can you hear me?
yes,
Could you hear me, Joseph?
I can now. Yes.
So Weeks and Irvin, you can, they can wire into that. And I'm trying to think, this is terrible. I'm using a new attorney for this closing on the 30th, and I can't remember the name of them, but they accepted wires too.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the way to start going, particularly when we're trying to get as far from physical contact as possible. So that's something that we'll see continue to go on. And then the most important paragraph 5 is the all bold, which in really no uncertain terms basically says that even if it's a clear default in contract, the escrow agent will not disperse earnest money until both parties have executed an agreement authorizing the disbursement, right? And that's either going to come from Form 515, or excuse me, 518, 517, or the mediation agreement. You need to make sure you explain this very clearly to the buyer and seller. We are currently in an earnest money dispute that we've been in since May, where it is very obvious that the buyer defaulted on the contract. I mean, they changed their mind, and the seller is just furious at both us as well as the escrow agent because he doesn't understand. It's so clear they're defaulting on it, why the earnest money just doesn't get released. It is earnest money, meaning it's escrow money, meaning it's not our money. So it's regulated by the state. The state will not allow, if that escrow agent were to disperse this money without one of these 3 things here, they not only would lose his escrow license, if they even have one, it would probably be disbarred. So it's really important to explain to the buyer and seller that yes, earnest money is a promise to perform on the contract. And even if it's so blatantly obvious that they don't perform, we still have to have an agreement to disperse. 9 times out of 10, we work it out. This is going to be one I'll be interested to see where this current one turns out, because it is $30,000 in earnest money. So it's a little different than trying to work out $1,000 earnest money deal. All right, transaction costs, paragraph 6, page 2. This is where it breaks down it's more of a disclosure paragraph in the first part of what breaks down to be actual buyer's transaction costs, as well as what are going to be seller's transaction costs. It is important to go through these with your client, and this, by the way, is a good script to follow. Just want to let you know, Mr. Buyer, your transaction costs are going to be included but not limited to these items right here. Same for the seller. Here are some things that you're going to have. You're going to have more than just the commission and proration and that sort of thing. You're going to have your deed stamps. You're going to have your deed recording. You're going to have, you're going to be paying for taxes if it hasn't been paid for this year that you've lived in it. So you just want to make sure you use this as the opportunity to explain that to them. The second paragraph in here talks about the costs that are needed to obtain information from the homeowners association, either private or public transfer fees, any costs similar to these fees, certificate of assessments, working capital contributions, estoppel fees, anything else. It does say here whether or not the seller or the buyer are going to pay for it. If no box is checked, these costs will be added to the seller's transaction costs. The thing you want to keep in mind in here is part of your checklist as a listing agent should be for your seller to confirm with the HOA that there have been no changes in fees since they purchased. And you want to get something in writing, even if it's an email from the HOA that states there are no capital contribution fees or anything like that. The reason that I say that that's important is because you could have a seller that's not very involved in their HOA at all and didn't realize that their HOA has voted in some sort of fee that they didn't know about. And then in negotiations, they see that and they think, well, it's not that big of a deal. There's really no transaction costs that are associated with our HOA. Let's not use up our negotiation bandwidth. We'll just leave this. And then you come to closing, there's a contribution fee of a couple $1,000 that could hit pretty hard. So you just want to make sure that you verify with your HOA from the seller standpoint that there are no additional fees on there. And then the third paragraph that comes on, paragraph 6, is where you disclose, or I should say ask for the seller to pay a portion of or all of the buyer's transaction costs. This is a dollar amount that was put in here. It used to be a dollar amount or a percentage. This would basically allow that money to be paid on behalf of the buyer from the seller's side. It does do a good job of making sure that money can be applied pretty much anywhere. However, you want to make sure as a buyer's agent, you have a pretty clear understanding of how much it can be. We've had this a couple of times where, you know, a buyer has asked for up to 3% of closing costs to be paid. You know, $200,000 house, they're asking for $6,000 in closing costs. Now the seller could be okay with that if it's the price, they're netting the price that they have, but that was more money based on the loan program that the buyer was using. That was more money than the buyer needed, right? And you can't just write a check to the buyer outside of closing. Win for the seller, they're paying fewer in closing costs now. However, the buyer at this point is, you know, where they thought they were netting, you know, a lower price on the house, they may not be getting it. So you want to make sure you're in good communication with the lender when you're doing that, just to make sure that you're not over promising or over asking for something, and then therefore putting your buyer in a situation where they're, you know, not getting the same amount of a deal on their house that they thought. Typically, if that does happen and there's enough notice given, there can be an adjustment of everything to make it a win-win. It's when it happens the day before closing where the seller's kind of holding the cards and just says, no, I'm not changing. And they have to close on time.
Joseph, do you see people trying to make up the difference, like in extra years of HOA dues or anything? Extra.
Yes. There have been ways to try to do that, but even sometimes we do run into exhausting that.
Okay.
There's also, because a lot of those too, the lender may not allow that.
Right.
From that standpoint. To be very, very clear though, one of the options is never that it's paid outside of closing. We've even had a listing agent or a buyer's agent ask that the seller, he sent it to me in an email one time. This is a personal listing, not our personal home, but a listing that we had where the buyer's agent sent me an email saying, hey, the seller's asked, since it was like a $2,200 difference, if they would just leave a cashier's check in the kitchen drawer. And quite honestly, the seller was like, look, I mean, that's what I agreed to. I don't have a problem with it. But the attorney was like, if you are going to do that, now that you've said you're considering it, like, I can't close this. So it's not allowed. All right, paragraph 7, financing. This is the disclosure of the financing, right? What type of financing they're going to get, when they're going to apply for it. This really, quite honestly, should not be more, as far as, you know, the date to apply for it. Minimize this so I can see it. Should not be more than a couple of days. If they're in a position to be purchasing a home, they should be in a position to be applying for the loan. And then it says they'll get a pre-final loan approval that by this date here. This really isn't great. I mean, it says with no unreasonable credit, income, or asset conditions. You really, it states this very, very clearly. Final loan approval occurs when lender funds the loan. It says that a couple times in this paragraph. You know, you can tighten this up all that you want. At the end of the day, unless it's something where the buyer goes out and just misrepresents or default, you know, goes and buys a brand new Porsche or something like that that causes the loan to fall through at the last minute, you don't have final approval on the loan until it closes, right? So if something does come up where the lender, you know, the final asset verification or everything was not correct, you do run, it's not as black and white that they just didn't do it on time. Okay, so you just want to make sure, again, because a lot of times the sellers are really stuck on that, you know, well, they didn't get approval on time, they were outside of this, well, maybe, and we can choose to fight this, which, you know, we can, or we figure out how to fix it and or put it back on the market and get another buyer. It does specifically state in here, if the buyer does change their lender, that they have to make the seller know within a certain amount of calendar days, which is what this sentence says. It also states in the following sentence after that, that you cannot change lenders if such change causes a change in the closing date. So if you come back and say, hey, I'm going to change lenders, but it's also going to change the closing date, it really goes without saying, to be honest with you, because they'd have to change the closing date regardless. This is just an extra disclosure to really kind of keep the buyers in check that they don't continue to shop their loan around and then at the last minute, try to change lenders and change everything on the closing date. And then it talks about who the lender is, what type of loan, FHA, VA, conventional, or seller financing. And then if it is FHA or VA, then there either is or is not addendum attached. You want to make sure that if it is FHA and VA, that you do have that addendum attached. That responsibility falls on both agents, right? So if they submit it and don't have it, then have it filled out, have your client sign it, with your counter offer. It needs to be part of it. There's no reason to not have that on there. All right. So paragraph 8, everyone's favorite. It's my favorite, at least. Paragraph 8 is your repair paragraph. So basically there are 3 options as it relates to repairs for your buyers when they're purchasing a home. First is repair procedure. The second is due diligence, and the third is as is. They are weighted in favor of the seller in the sense that as is obviously being the best case scenario, right? The buyer knows they're purchasing the property. They can get inspections. They can do whatever they want, but they're under contract. They can't ask for anything. They can't get out. They can't do anything like that. The repair procedure is the most specific one. And I'm just going to go through in order. I normally do them the other order, but I'm doing them this way just to kind of see how the flow goes. Repair procedure, the best way to look at a repair procedure option in repairs is that you are agreeing ahead of time on the repairs that the seller will do if needed, right? So what repair procedure says is all repairs and inspections and requests shall be completed and delivered to the seller by a certain date, 6 p.m. on a certain date. So when you're picking this date, you keep in mind that you have to have enough time to both get the inspection, get the results, and then review the results to see what you want to have requested. Now, you can only request, and you can request anything, right? Let's just be clear, that will happen. But then it says any and all requests necessary to place the heating system, air conditioning system, electrical system, plumbing systems, water supply systems, water waste systems to be conveyed in operative condition, to make roof free of leaks, to address any environmental concerns, and to make improvements structurally sound should be delivered by the deadline above. Okay. Now, again, it's stating that the request for those should be delivered by them. And then goes further on to say those are the only ones that the seller is responsible for. If the buyer fails to notify the seller within this time frame, the buyer shall have waived any and all rights under the terms of this section. So if you get an inspection and you don't put the seller on notice or send a request for these repairs by this deadline, then you basically waived this opportunity. And we'll talk about what that looks like down the road, what they can do with it. If the lender's commitment requires any additional inspections, these are to be provided by the buyer. It doesn't really give any conditions on that. Buyer at buyer's expense shall have the privilege and responsibility of inspecting the structure, square footage, environmental concerns included but not limited to mold, radon gas, lead-based paint hazards including lead-based paints, wetlands study, appurtenant buildings, heating systems, air conditioning systems, electrical systems, plumbing systems, water waste systems, as well as appurtenant equipment and appliances. Upon seller's request, the buyer will provide a copy of the inspection report. So it basically goes on to continue to say they shall have the responsibility of inspecting the property, right? It kind of goes in reverse order here. It should really say you have the right and responsibility to do it, and then you submit your requests. However, they put the deadline first so you understand what that is. Very important sentence here. Upon seller's request, the buyer will provide. Will provide, not may, right? It's will. So it is a requirement if the seller asks that the buyer does have to provide a copy of the inspection report per the contract. So then once that report has been submitted, or once that all has been submitted, the seller has until 6 p.m. on whatever date we put in here. I would say at least have 3 days from past this date up here. And the reason is because when your seller gets this request, your seller needs to have time to then submit those to a contractor to find out, well, first to review it to see what is covered and what's not, and then have that submitted to a contractor to find out if it's something they can financially do. or agree to do. So by this date, the seller shall deliver notice agreeing or not agreeing to make the repairs and buyer's repair requests. The cost of all repairs to heating system, air conditioning system, electrical systems, plumbing, water supply, wastewater system, making them operable, roof-free leaks, address environmental concerns, and to make improvements structurally sound to be paid by the seller. Seller paid repairs. So there's two schools of thought on this. One could be, a lot of agents will say, okay, if I'm representing the seller and I get this repair request with 23 items and only 15 are technically covered, I'm going to write back, I'm going to give notice by this date that says I agree to cover seller paid repairs per the contract. That's nice. However, I don't know that I'm going to leave that open-ended. I'm actually going to counter on the repair addendum and say, hey, I'm striking all these because I ain't paying for them. Now, if you want to send the contractor out there and have them done, this is the only part I'm going to be paying for. Then it specifically says seller paid requests do not include home maintenance, flooring, fogged windows, grandfathered code issues, landscaping, preventative maintenance, cosmetic changes, home improvement, and energy efficiency. Seller contractually agrees to make all the requested seller paid repairs. If the seller contractually agrees to make all requested seller paid repairs, the parties agree to proceed under the amended contract. The repairs to any other items are the sole responsibility of the buyer. So basically at this point, it says if the seller contractually agrees to make all requested seller paid repairs, again, it's specifically saying seller paid repairs, so not all requested repairs, then they agree to proceed under the contract. It's important to know the verbiage of this paragraph very well, because if you have a buyer's agent that's asking for things that are not included, and they start to say things like, well, this is a safety issue, or this is a code issue, or this is a whatever issue, you always can rely back to the contract. The contract is actually very clear in this one. There are not a lot of areas that are super gray. The only ones that we're seeing gray right now would be, we had one where there was not the proper sealant put in the garage that was shared by the neighbor's property in a single family attached that was fireproof sealant. We could have argued, right? But if you have a contractor out there doing everything else and this is another $50, what's $50, right? Where was I going with that?
So Joseph, it's not saying that because I just did this actually, it's not saying that the buyer can't ask for other things. It's saying that the buyer should not expect the seller to do anything other than the things that they're required to do in this paragraph.
Correct.
All right. Yeah.
And that verbiage, Shenandoah, is probably the best way to describe it to your seller.
Okay.
Because what I see happen so often is we go in and we're like, repair procedures best. They can only do this. They can only do this. And then it's not, and by the way, it's 9 times out of 10, not the agent's fault, right? Don't blame the buyer's agent. And don't be smug in your response. I used to be incredibly smug in my response until Lynn saw my response one time and said, I would hate you if I was the buyer's agent on that. Like you're not collaborating like you profess to do all the time. Because a lot of times it's the buyers that are saying, well, let's just ask, particularly if there's nothing wrong with the house, because then they just want to negotiate, right?
Right.
So you always say I love the verbiage that you said, say, listen, I'm not going to tell you they won't ask for everything, but they should not expect you to probably do anything that other than what's written here.
Right.
Okay. Now, that being said, if you do get a repair request that is, in your eyes ridiculous, it may not hurt to call the buyer's agents to say, hey, thank you for this. I'm going to submit it. I want to go through from them. I know that my client's a pretty big stickler on the contract. I know a handful of these are outside of the repair procedure. Can you shed some light on that? Is there a misunderstanding from the buyer standpoint? Like, help me kind of understand what this looks like a little bit, just so I can explain to them. Normally what you'll find out from that part is there's just a misunderstanding of it, or they're just asking. They're like, you know what, they're wanting a ton wrong, and they feel like this is what home ownership should look like, and that this, that the carpet shouldn't be ripped or something. And it's like, okay, I mean, I'll let them know.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so if the seller does not timely respond per above or does not agree to make the seller paid repairs, the buyer shall within 2 calendar days, this is 2 calendar days from this date here, choose one of the following: accept the property in present condition, negotiate a new amended contract, which is probably not going to happen because you're only in this position because the seller hasn't responded, or terminate the contract by delivered notice. So if you're the buyer, and you've submitted this repair request and the seller hasn't gotten back to you 2 calendar days after this date up here, you either need to be prepared to accept the property in as is condition or terminate the contract. Now, you can send a termination and it could cause the buyer to say, well, no, wait, I'll do it. But understand that by sending the termination after this deadline, but within 2 days, that contract's dead. So if, let's just say this is a Friday at 6, as long as I, as the buyer, send them a notice of termination by that Sunday, I'm out. The contract's dead. The seller can't come back and say, no, sorry, we are going to do these, we are going to do that. The contract is over at that point. So we just want to make sure you stay. That's why they always say time is of the essence in these. So just understanding that. Now, it also states that if you do not do that as the buyer, you are delivering. If buyer fails to accept, renegotiate, or terminate this contract within 2 calendar days, they agree to buy and seller agrees to sell as is. So it is worth the risk of irritating the seller if you haven't heard back and sending a termination instead of being caught purchasing it as is. Okay. Questions about repair procedure? Clear as mud, Christina?
I think I got a little confused. Like, okay, so I'm trying to write notes. So I wrote only 2 days after. What do you call the date where you have no later than 6 p.m. on such and such date, seller shall deliver notice agreeing or not agreeing to make repairs?
Okay, great question. I like how you were very succinct on like what you're asking. I would call this the seller response date.
Okay.
For lack of a better way to put it. Yep. So you've got the buyer request date and then the seller response date.
Okay.
Anything else?
No, that was it. I was just a little, I was trying to write notes and I was like, ooh, I don't know what to put.
Good. You're good.
Thank
All right,
you.
due diligence. This is the second option. Due diligence from a buyer standpoint is one of the best options. Basically what due diligence is it defines a time period that expires at 6 p.m. on a certain date. Any extension has to be agreed upon by both parties. During this time period, here's what happens. They conduct and obtain inspections. They deliver requests of any repairs that they want. They then decide to proceed under a changed contract because they've said, hey, here are the repairs that I want. Or they proceed as is as the contract is. Or they terminate the contract by delivering a notice of termination. Right? So if 1, 2, and 3 are always going to be, well, I should say 1 and 2 are always going to be done. And then if it's not, if you're not going to actually request repairs, or if the seller says no, then one of the 3, 4, or 5 has to be done by the deadline above. So there's no like response date or anything. Everything happens within this one lumped time frame.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you have a due diligence date of 6 p.m. on Friday and it's 5:30 and you haven't heard back from the seller, then you send a termination at 5:55. Because if you don't, it basically says during the due diligence period, should buyer fail to obtain a new contract or timely properly terminate this contract, then the buyer agrees to buy and seller agrees to sell as is, which you don't want to happen. Now you can send an extension, but if they don't sign the extension and you haven't sent the termination and that deadline goes by, then technically as it's written in the contract, you're going to buy it as is. So, what you could do is at 5 o'clock, send an extension. Hey, give us until, I'll give you till Monday at 5 to respond, Mr. Seller. And then if you haven't heard anything by 5:55, then you send the termination. But everything gets happened during that time. So you have your inspections done, you can request repairs, the seller, can negotiate repairs, do everything there. And as long as you get that repair addendum signed during that agrees to the repairs that they are going to do or pay or whatever they do, then that suffices. But if you don't have that signed and you don't sign a termination or you don't send a termination, then you're moving forward as is.
Okay.
Okay. pretty simple. Now, it says at any time, the buyer can unilaterally terminate this contract only by delivering to seller both notice of termination and a termination fee of blank. We're starting to see this to cover, we're seeing some people are saying it has to be as much as the earnest money. What's becoming a little more common practice is whatever the time frame is to carry the property. So if it's, if you've got 2 weeks for due diligence and going rate for their mortgage payment, if they're making a $2,000 mortgage payment, it'll be $1,000. Or if rent was $2,000, it'd be $1,000. Just to say, hey, that's fine, Mr. Buyer, if you want to terminate at any time, but we want reimbursement for having the home off the property. Now, some buyers are still refusing to give the termination fee because their agents are saying, no, the point of due diligence is to be able to terminate. At that point, you just need to discuss with your seller whether or not they feel the risk is worth taking the home off the market with no termination fee.
Did you say how you decide what the what the termination fee is?
Yeah, I mean, it's as the buyer's agent, you want to start with as low as possible.
Okay.
Right? But if I'm a listing agent, I'm going to at least ask for, I would say to my seller, hey, if it's off the market for 2 weeks, are you okay if we ask for them to pay like half of your mortgage payment? And
Okay.
they'll say, sure, and let's just say, for example, that's $1,000. It's negotiable, right? And it's negotiable in the original negotiations.
We didn't win it, but last night we wrote an offer for a property, and those people are from North Carolina, so they're used to due diligence.
Right.
So I said, let's just do it like we do in North Carolina. 1% of the asking price will split between earnest money and termination fee. Boom, that's what we did. I can't fix said stupid seller, but it was a nice termination fee. But is that, so the termination fee though, here in South Carolina is given to whom?
Given directly to the buyer.
No,
to the seller. Directly to the seller.
So it's like we terminate and then the buyer gives the seller the termination fee.
Yeah, I mean, how it's written, it says it's delivered with the termination. What typically happens is you send a termination and then send a release of the earnest money. That splits, let's say you had $2,000 earnest money, you had $1,000 earnest termination fee.
Mm-hmm.
You would send the termination and then you'd also send the release of contract that splits the earnest money.
So you do have to send the release of earnest money with the termination and the termination fee. Is that right?
For the earnest money to be released, yes.
Okay. All right. And so is there any talk of like getting this termination fee up front in South Carolina?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. All right. But in due diligence, we can ask for anything.
You can ask for anything, sure.
Right.
Yes.
Yep.
All right, and then the last of the three options under repairs is as is, which is what everything defaults to should you not come to an agreement or a termination, right? Which basically means that the property is being sold as is, but the buyer can buy the property for the purchase price and the seller needs to maintain the property from the effective date. They can have inspections done by this date. I don't know why they put a date on there, but the seller is under no obligation to remedy any issue the buyer discovers during their inspections. The buyer may not terminate the contract based on the results of any inspections conducted. There's a conflict, quite honestly, between these, in that this states right here, they may not terminate the contract based on any results of any inspections conducted. If later they have this contingent on the CO 100, there's a little conflict in the contract, and I need to get kind of clarification from the SCR attorneys on what prevails at that point. Typically, the expectation is that the buyer's not expecting it to be clear, the CO 100 to be clear if they're going in with as is. However, we always default to the contract. So, all right. Paragraph 9 basically just describes what inspections are, right? Inspections, reinspection rights, or the rights, I should say, the buyer has. The buyer and their licensed and insured inspectors can reasonably perform non-destructive inspections, and the seller agrees that they will give reasonable access. They won't have any blocked access to the areas that need to be inspected. Really, the main ones are going to be access to the attic, access to the electrical panel, any plumbing access that they need to see. That's again without having to go behind drywall. There won't be anything blocked from there. It does, the first part of the bold does say seller will grant the buyer the right to perform a final walkthrough inspection of the property within 48 hours prior to the closing date. Seller will keep all utilities on operational through closing unless otherwise agreed. So what that means is if the buyer wants to do an inspection anywhere before 48 hours within the closing date, the seller does not have to let them do that. Or I should say final walkthrough. 9 times out of 10, the final walkthrough is not going to be ready to happen until the day before closing, if not the morning of. So just want to keep that in mind. Paragraph 10, basically you're going to select whether or not the contract is or is not contingent on the appraised value of the property. If it is contingent on the appraised value and the purchase price, the appraised value comes in as less than the purchase price. If the seller agrees to lower the purchase price and keep all the other terms of the contract, the buyer has to stay in the contract. If the seller does not agree to lower the purchase price, the buyer can renegotiate or can terminate and get their earnest money released to them without penalty. Or it'd say the contract is not contingent upon the property being valued as an appraised. You don't often see those, even in cash deals. A lot of people say, well, in cash deals, they don't care. You still want a home that appraises, even if it's a cash deal. Now, do they have more leeway? Sure. The thing to keep in mind, though, from the seller's standpoint is the seller is in control. However, where we're seeing this kind of bite the sellers by surprise a little bit is, let's just, for round numbers, you have a $200,000 house. Say a buyer comes in and offers $200,000, but they want $5,000 in closing costs paid. And the seller says, well, this is the first offer I've gotten, and I've only been on the market for a couple days. If I'm going to accept this, then I want to net the $200,000. So I'm going to raise the purchase price to $205,000 to cover the closing costs, and we can go from there. The challenge is if the house doesn't appraise, and let's say the house only appraises at $200,000, the buyer doesn't have to accept it. Excuse me, the seller does not have to accept that. However, you typically only find this out within a couple weeks of closing. And at that point, the seller's probably packed, ready to go. And you can renegotiate, yes. But if you decide not to and the seller walks, then you're in a precarious situation. And all you can accept is the change to $200,000. You still have to pay the closing costs and everything. So you just want to make sure you're being careful on netting, or not netting the price. Well, yeah, netting the price up to cover closing costs, and not doing it to a level that's you're gonna get appraised out.
Oh, can you review that again? Because I do this all the time.
You just want to be careful that if you raise the price to cover the closing costs,
Right.
but you're not pricing yourself out of being appraised.
Right.
Because if that does happen, no, the seller doesn't have to agree to it, but they're also in a pressure cooker if it's within a couple weeks of closing.
They don't
Right.
have to, because that 5,000 we all knew was wrapped into.
They don't
So-
have to agree to change just the purchase price, right? So if they agree to change the purchase price, that's great, but they're still having to pay the 5,000.
Gotcha. I
So
gotcha.
it's not one of those where they can just say, well, sure, I'll go to 200,000, but I'm not paying your closing costs. They can't say that. I mean, they can, but the buyer doesn't have to.
Gotcha. Okay. Right. Okay. Thank you.
Say anything. Sometimes they do. All right, paragraph 11, wood infestation report. This is where you disclose whether or not the property is contingent upon the buyer or seller having the property inspected by an inspector chosen by the buyer or seller, and then obviously the buyer or seller will timely deliver that notice. Great rule of thumb here is if you represent the buyer, you should have the buyer pay for this and select the inspector. It's their own inspector. They're already paying a couple $100 for the home inspection. There's no reason they shouldn't also have the CL 100 inspection representing them versus the seller. There does put a deadline in here that it has to be after 30 calendar days prior to closing, and then no later than however many calendar days prior to closing. If the buyer is responsible for having the property inspected and they miss this deadline, then they've technically waived this contract, waived this contingency. If something does come up in order to clear the CL 100, the buyer can either accept the property in its present condition, which 9 times out of 10, or not 9 times out of 10, a lot of times the lender won't allow, so you just want to be careful on that. They can negotiate with the seller for payment of these, or they can terminate the contract. However, if something does come up in the CO 100 and the seller agrees to address it, the buyer has to stay in the contract. It's very similar to repair procedure. All right, lots of disclosures from here forward. Paragraph 12 just basically says that it's advice from the brokers that the buyer have the property surveyed, the title examined, elevation, wetlands, beachfront determined, do any research for insurance, anything. You do all of that on your own. Its buyers are solely responsible for investigating pricing, availability, coverage, and requirements of the insurance for the property prior to signing the contract, right? Again, it's specifically stated in here. So if you don't know what the insurance is going to be and then you find out it's astronomical and you're already under contract, that doesn't matter. It's not a way for you to get out of the contract. Paragraph 13 states that if there are any things in the contract that are not performed by closing, that they still will be performed after closing. So if there's a repair the seller needed to do, they'll still have to do it after closing. I wouldn't rely on this because nothing gives you as much leverage as the actual closing does. So just be careful on that. Paragraph 14 discloses or talks about when you're going to get the home, whether or not you're going to get a home warranty. Talks about who's going to order it, whether or not it will be provided at closing, how much, who's going to pay for it, and who the home warranty company is. Also goes on and discloses for you that there is a chance that one of the agents will be paid a referral or processing fee, some sort of compensation for it, which is fine. The clients need to know that anyway. Paragraph 15 basically says if there's any sort of casualty or injury or fire or anything to the property, that the seller will be responsible to repair all the damages or to give the buyer sufficient funds for repairs or assign the buyer the right to all proceeds from any insurance. So if something goes on, you basically go for, if something happens like a fire or a natural disaster, you go back into negotiations at that point. Paragraph 16, property disclosure statement that says whether or not the seller has or has not completed the property's disclosure. 9 times out of 10 that will have to have been done. And also states that the buyer understands that does not replace inspections. This is the information on the property as to the best of the seller's knowledge, and they are not an inspector or anything. They also, that in the event they do find anything that was not covered on the property disclosure, after it was delivered, that they will go back and correct it and make you aware as soon as possible. Paragraph 17 says if in the event the home was built prior to 1978, may contain lead-based paint, and everybody agrees to sign the disclosures regarding the safety of or hazards of lead-based paint. Paragraph 18 says if there's any information that the buyer or seller want about some sex offender or criminal information, that brokers are not responsible to get that. Trust account information. I don't know any escrow agents that have interest-bearing trust accounts, so it's really a moot point. However, this is where the buyer would disclose that they are okay with the escrow agent holding their escrow money in an interest-bearing account. If you put no on here, it doesn't limit you. Like I said, I don't know many of the escrow agents that hold this, that have interest-bearing accounts. Paragraph 20, South Carolina income tax or non-residents gain in compliance basically says the seller and buyer will comply with any provisions of South Carolina laws, meaning that if there's a non-resident for the seller, that they will participate with the attorney because the attorney will more than likely take non-resident tax out at closing. This is an entire and binding agreement. This is a short but important paragraph. Parties agree that this contract expresses the entire agreement between the parties. There are no other agreements, oral or otherwise, modifying the terms of this contract. Where that comes up, occupancy prior to closing, or going to rent back after the closing. If you have any of those agreements, it needs to be part of this. So agreements outside of closing, I'm going to pay you the extra amount on my closing costs or whatever it may be. Paragraph 22 talks about adjustments. It basically says the buyer and seller agree to settle or prorate annual or as appropriate any fees, HOA, utilities, prepaids, taxes, anything may be will be prorated as of the closing date. And the day of closing belongs to the seller. Paragraph 23 talks about what the risk is if the seller or the buyer defaults. I don't encourage you getting super involved in explaining the legal ramifications of defaulting. However, you can say, what I know, Mr. and Mrs. Sellers, you could be risk at these things here. So if you are, as a seller that defaults in the contract, the buyer can pursue any remedies available to them. They can recover attorney's fees and any direct costs if you're found to be in default. So just want to be careful of that. If they have any further questions that are not covered in these 3 on this one, or these 3 on this one, and they're wondering if they could terminate the contract or be in default, you should point them in the direction of an attorney, which you are not. Mediation. Basically, they will take the option of mediating should there be a dispute in this to avoid any expensive, lengthy, or uncertain litigations. Most of the time that mediation is handled, we are very fortunate in the Charleston area that the majority of brokers here work well together in conflict. I will tell you, I have yet to go to, minimal times have we actually gone to mediation as it officially appears, right? We've a lot of times worked it out between the brokerages to basically work as mediators. Typically, if we get to a point where we haven't come to an agreement, everyone agrees that there's not going to be an agreement, even if you have a mediator. And at that point, we would pursue the legal action. Paragraph 25 basically says that you are entering this contract voluntarily, that nobody is, I haven't stipulated or induced you or anything as an agent. Paragraph 26 basically says, as a broker, I am not anything other than a real estate agent. I'm not an HVAC guy. I'm not an inspector. I'm not a surveyor, an appraiser, a roofing guy, anything else, that I am simply a real estate agent. Broker compensation, basically say that the attorney will use the settlement funds to collect and disperse the broker's compensation, and that the broker's compensation was already negotiated ahead of time. Paragraph 28 talks about if there are any other attachments, contingencies, or terms or stipulations. This is where you would reference, it's already referenced a couple times in the contract. I would also reference, if you did the addendum that stated, here are the, or excuse me, not addendum, the bill of sale. If you had the home sale contingency in there, I would reference it here as well. So you want to make sure that you have all of that in there. You said carpet?
Christina,
Oh,
did
yeah.
we lose?
If you wanted any floors or any allowance or anything in there, you could put that in this one.
So
It's-
in
yeah.
28, this is where you would put the carpet thing. Is
Yes.
that what you were talking about, Shenandoah?
Yes, that could
Okay.
be an area that you would put it in.
So
Okay.
just what would be, so in this particular case, this lady wanted $4,000 credit to replace carpet. What's the best practice for that?
You could just put that in this one, or an addendum that states seller to provide for, however much credit or allowance. Now, you're going to have to get specific on that, because it's also going to, what that looks like is they'll either, the attorney will hold it in escrow, so you have to have a specific carpet person you can use. You can also add it to your closing costs. Like if you're not already asking a lot for closing costs, then you can add it to that. However, if you've already maxed out your closing costs and you put that in here, you're more than likely going to have the lender say, hey, we want this going to a contractor, not directly to the buyer.
Okay.
So then they're just financing the money being paid to them.
Mm-hmm.
Paragraph 29 talks about what notice is. It's the unilateral communication of offers, counteroffers, acceptance, terminations, everything from party to party. Will be delivered to the email address or fax written on or listed on page 9, unless otherwise agreed upon. Paragraph 30 basically states that they need to verify all wiring instructions. They also are advised and understood that audio and visual surveillances may occur in the property, and parties should plan accordingly and comply with all federal, state, and local laws. So from the seller standpoint, if you're going to surveil, you need to do it legally. And if a buyer standpoint, if you're going to be in their house, you need to understand they may be surveilling you. Contract, the South Carolina also states that we have that they have received, reviewed, read, and understand all of the contracts that they're signing. Now, just because it says that here doesn't mean that they do. So that's why it's important to know the form So because what you don't ever want to do is get into a situation, and unfortunately we've been into this more than I'm honestly comfortable last couple of months, is where we've had clients that are just adamantly against that's something they had signed. And yes, a lot of times it can be there's a situation where these are adults and they did sign some paperwork, right? That they should read that paperwork. Yet we are also their representatives that should be explaining this paperwork to them to the best of our knowledge. So you want to make sure that you're not getting into that and say, well, it says on the disclosure here that you read, reviewed, and understand everything. Well, clearly that's not the case from their perspective. So it's just important to know all of this, or I should say know as much of this as possible to give them that comfort. Paragraph 31 is the expiration of offer. This is obviously if you present the offer when it expires. If you are going to respond prior to this, you also then want to change the expiration of offers. So if you submit the offer to me today, a Tuesday at 3:15, and it expires tomorrow at 5, and I respond tomorrow at noon, I'm going to change this expiration of offer for the counter to be the following day, so we can keep all of the changes, initials, everything within contract. And then everybody signs and puts their information on the rest of it. And that is the agreement to buy and sell real estate.
Joseph, I have a crazy question.
Okay.
On this lovely last page right here,
Yes.
is it okay to be witchy if you're the listing agent and the buyer doesn't bother to put your information in there?
I mean, it's, well, I mean, you could just put your information on there, right? When you counter, I put it in there because technically if you put it in there, or if they put the wrong email address in there and then they send it and they send it to the wrong one that they put in there, they've performed on the contract. So if there's an email address you prefer to get stuff to, it's in your best interest to change it to the one you want, because as the contract's written, it says the notice of any unilateral notice is to be given on the emails listed below.
Gotcha.
So they get, for whatever reason, like, so for instance, I've got Joseph at KW and I got Joseph Saltmarsh Properties, right? Well, let's say I put Joseph Saltmarsh Properties and I don't check that, but that's on there, right? They send me a termination and I don't get it because it was sent to that email. Well, in the contract, it's saying that it's okay for them to send it to that email.
Gotcha.
You just want to make sure that you use your best email, or that your best email's on there.
Gotcha. Always good.
All right. Anything else?
No, I think that was helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Go through, fill one out, send it to me, see if you have any questions, and just keep writing contracts and we'll get houses under contract.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Yep. Christina, thank you so much for being here. You too, Shenandoah. I appreciate all your questions.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.